Gasoline prices at the pump have come down from the stratosphere, at least in some parts of the US. However, we also heard that inflation hit 9% in June. So, how deep does inflation still go? Welcome to Global Sourcing Insights from SIPS. This edition is a co production of SIPS Americas and the Michigan State University Broad College of Business. I'm Bob Rossback. Here to give us some insights we can use to plan our procurement strategies is Jason Miller, Associate Professor in the Broad College of Business. Welcome, Jason.
Welcome. Thanks so much for having me on, Bob.
So, you have data. A lot of people are just working on perceptions and anecdotal evidence. They go to the gas pump and they think, oh my gosh, we're in a recession. Or they read one headline about Target dumping inventory and they're thinking, oh, everybody's going to lose their job. So why don't you walk us through your set of slides here? And I think this is all about inflation and how deep is it and how long might it last. So go ahead and tell us about your first slide. What is this data about inflationary pressures?
Yeah, so what I like to think about really for inflationary pressures right now is trying to understand what the cost pass-through situation is that the consumer is facing. And so while most of the focus is on the consumer price index, that's what consumers are paying today. Where I'm very curious about is what are we seeing for year-over-year percent changes that the manufacturers of those finished goods are receiving. And so this slide here is plotting three different series of data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Producer Price Index program. And the first one to take a look at is the PPI for final demand finished goods. So this is the price manufacturers are receiving for products that are considered final demand. So a finished car, flour at the grocery store, meat, things of that sort. You can see right now our year-over-year change is at 18.4% as of June. And that was the highest reading we've had so far during this inflationary cycle. So what I would tell you is that suggests we've got quite a long ways to go until we start to see this black line start to slow itself and come back down. And the reason I say that is look how persistent it is over time. The value today is very correlated with the value the next month. So when I'm starting to see headlines saying, oh, inflationary pressures are about to ease and ease substantially, I hate to break it to everybody, that does not appear to be the case in the data. And I say that not only because this series is persistent, but because of this red line. Now, what this red line is measuring is the price change for the inputs used by those finished goods manufacturers, which they're called stage 4 goods producers in the BLS's lingo. So
these would be what I might call tier 1 suppliers, cost to tier 1 suppliers.
So
cost to the OEMs.
Exactly.
Cost to the OEMs. Okay.
Exactly. This is your cost that Ford is experiencing. This is the cost Kellogg or Kraft is experiencing, right, for their inputs. We see right now that those prices, yes, it looks like the year-over-year change has peaked, but we're still up 14% year-over-year. And again, notice how stable this series is. Best case scenario, I'm drawing this down. It's another 6 to 9 months at least of very substantial year-over-year price increases. And those are for inputs. And that's going to get passed on to the consumer. Now we look even further upstream into the inputs for those tier 1 suppliers, which BLS calls stage 3 goods producers. So this is going to be the inputs for seats at Lear or Johnson Control, as an example, or the inputs to a plastic product manufacturer that's making the plastic packaging for a Kraft or a Kellogg. We do have evidence year over year we've peaked very strongly, but we're still elevated 20%. And even again, if I draw the exact same line down, I'm still looking at another 6 to 9 months to get this back down to, let's say, a 4 or 5% level consistent with what we saw in 2018.
So it does make sense that the consumer prices, what we feel, are going to be lagging the lowered prices through the OEMs and the tier 1. Exactly. They're going to be ahead of, and that's why the black line is still going up, and even while the other ones are starting to go down. Got it. Okay.
Exactly. So that's where, people have asked me how long do I think the CPI is going to be elevated, even with interest rate increases. barring something very, very, very strange happening, we're looking at another, at least 9 months that we're going to have high year-over-year ratings. There's just no
So
way
I
to do that.
shouldn't be eager for a price drop in my Ford Mach-E that I want to buy.
No, it does not look like that'll be the case. Now, how consumers will perceive this, though, may differ, because we're going to be talking gasoline and food prices. Those may come down more quickly because there's less of a lag. So gasoline, yes, that's gotten a little bit cheaper. So people may start experiencing that. And gasoline has a very oversized role in terms of how people think about inflation. And so it will be interesting to see if the psychology almost flips and that consumers are feeling better, even though the CPI data is likely to still be rough the next 6 to 9 months.
All right, let's move on.
So this next slide is focusing specifically on inflationary pressures in the trucking sector. And I'm going to focus for a minute on really, dry van freight split between truckload and less than truckload. And again, this is Bureau of Labor Statistics PPI data. The blue line here is showing the truckload pricing. And what we can see here is finally a glimmer of hope, and that June saw that PPI drop a little bit, about 2.4% from May. Now, again, where we shouldn't get too excited, though, this is up 27.5% year over year. So given we've seen the spot market cool, that is translating a little bit into the contract pricing, which is what BLS mostly picks up. We may see a little bit of deflationary pressure in the second half of the year relative to the first half of the year. But I'm talking only a couple percent. There's no way we're going to be lower than we were in the back half of 21. So what I would tell you is don't hope for year over year percent declines, because we're not going to see that. Again, data is far too stable to suggest that could possibly happen. And that's for the truckload side. Less than truckload, I really hate to break it to everybody, but don't expect really any deflationary forces in the back half of the year. Why? LTL is an oligopoly. The carriers are incredibly disciplined now with their pricing, especially compared to, let's say, 14, 15 years ago. And you can even see when we went through the 2019 sort of freight recession period, whereas truckload prices did come down, LTL basically moves smooth and steady. And so we shouldn't really be expecting any deflationary forces there. So if you're doing your budgeting, again, you're looking at, 20, 25%. For those of you who keep track at home, this number right here mirrors very closely what JB Hunt just put up in their second quarter earnings call in terms of revenue growth. And while this is essentially revenue per transaction, it's eerily close. And so I have tremendous faith in what the BLS is doing here.
So the numbers don't lie.
Doesn't seem to be, which I think brings us now to the discussion of air freight. And I think, again, there being quite a bit of hope now that travel seems to be opening up, but now that we're dealing with B2.5 and I guess now B2.75, I can't even keep track of COVID anymore, type of situation, we're still seeing air freight prices very elevated. And this is data based on the actual transaction prices that BLS is getting from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. So this isn't even survey. This is as objective of data as you can get. Air freight from Asia to the US, it's up about 80% above where it was before COVID. Europe to the US, I mean, it feels like a bargain in comparison to that, but it's still up 45 to 50%.
Mm-hmm.
And so air freight relief, it's going to be a while again. And when you look actually at the metric tonnage of air freight coming into the United States, we're up 20% over 2018 levels, which were the prior peak. And so this idea that there's this slowdown taking place, we're not seeing it through May. May's air freight tonnage was up 20% over 2018 levels. And so there's still a lot of demand out there. Which brings us then to the containerized ocean side, where I'll tell you, again, it's funny where I'm more bullish on where output is at than most economists, but I'm also more bearish on the deflationary story. because as an example, this is the container shipping spot prices from Drewry for Shanghai to Los Angeles. So this is on a per 40-foot containerized basis, so per FEU. Right now, with the last reading from this source, this is early July, we're about $7,500 per FEU. And where folks are getting excited is they're saying, well, yes, we're down from the $12,000 per FEU highs that we were at, in about third quarter of 2021. But I look at this and say, let's go back to 2019. It was $1,800.
Yeah.
So where are we
So
going to
this looks to me like a case of, I've been down so long, it looks like up to me.
Exactly. This is one of those scenarios where I think our obsession with year-over-year comparisons is really confusing us on how economic conditions are, because last year was not normal at this time in the United States. We had just given out record stimulus and people were spending it left, right, and center. And so last year is just not a good baseline to go through. And the question that I have is, you look at this, where's this going to settle in at? And yes, it will pull down some of those contract prices, but we're not, I don't think anyone thinks we're going back to $1,800 per FEU. I think an absolute best case scenario is going back to late 2020's $4,000 per FEU, which, remind everyone at the time, people thought that was highway robbery back then until 2021 hit. And we thought, hey, $4,000, that sounds great, because now that's where contract prices are at in comparison. But that then brings us up, though, to the question, especially I see, of really how much is actually being paid. Because again, these are spot prices, and the large importers like Walmart are not paying spot prices. And so one thing I would recommend anybody do if you're a big importer, Census Bureau's USA Trade Online data, which is free, so the best type of data, you can query out incredibly detailed data, for example, down to the 6-digit harmonized tariff code per port that stuff is coming through by country of origin, as an example. And you can mirror this between their two databases to actually figure out the freight costs per kilogram of product, which is probably the best way you can actually get to measure things. And so when I'm thinking about what is actually being paid, that's sort of what I'm doing. And so as an example here of an index of what's actually being paid, what I've done here is focused on harmonized tariff code 94, which is going to be furniture, mattresses, et cetera. So stuff that almost exclusively is coming in containerized water. Originating in China, going through the import district of Los Angeles, which includes both the ports of LA and Long Beach. So I've eliminated right now as much outside variability as I can get by saying it's got to be coming through this port from this country of origin for this specific commodity category. And I'm calculating then what is the freight cost per kilogram of product, because you don't want to look at freight costs per the dollar value of imports, because guess what else is experiencing imports or experiencing inflation? It's going to be those imports. So if you do that and convert to an index using 2019 as the base, what you end up basically seeing is we're about double where we were pre-COVID. And that number is very consistent with like Container Trade Statistics global pricing index that they have, which is coming from the carriers. And so this would be very consistent with that story. May was encouraging because we did see a little bit of a decline, but we need to wait and see how this is going to play out longer. But when people start saying, oh, there's going to be immediate, relief, again, look how long it took us to get up. Even if we go back down at the same rate, which I'm doubting is going to happen, because big jumps like this down tend not to occur with data. They can occur up, but they don't occur down. We're still looking at incredibly elevated prices through the rest of this year. And so, again, hate to break it to everybody, but it's still going to be expensive to ship stuff by water through the rest of this year and into 2023, barring some weird cataclysmic event that we don't know of.
Okay.
And that then brings us to the fact of one thing we have seen in the data is, why has it felt that inflation became much worse in 2022? The answer is because we saw a lot more manufacturers actually implementing price changes than they were previously. And so this gets picked up in what's called the Quarterly Survey of Plant Capacity Utilization from the Census Bureau. And we can proxy the frequency of price changes by the extent that manufacturers are saying their capacity is changing, but their price, because they're changing price, yet their products are the same. And what you see here is, especially as we move from Q4 21 into Q1 of 22, just this massive increase in the number of manufacturers that said, hey, we changed our prices. And so that is making me feel that, especially, why does inflation seem so pronounced now? It's because we had a bunch of price changes that got implemented with essentially the start of the year. And food manufacturing is a classic example of that, where we saw this huge explosion in terms of the price of, food at home and the CPI that's corresponding exactly to this data.
So is this consumer products from manufacturers, or is this anything manufactured, no matter where it is what tier it is in the supply chain?
This is every manufacturing industry, just because the data is more reliable, but you actually can drill down in the census data to identify each individual industry sector.
Mm-hmm.
And so
we sort of had a sense of that from the earlier slides. So this is a composite.
Yep, this is a composite. But to end on as close to good news as we can get right now in the inflationary world. And that is, we did see as of June, the June average, that commodity prices had started to decline from essentially where their high was in 2022. So the way to read this plot basically is, since each different commodity is hitting a high at a different time of the year, is basically saying, what is June's price relative to whenever that high was for the first 6 months of this year? And so, for example, soybeans being zero said, hey, the actual transaction price for soybeans was at a high in June. So we're not seeing any type of relief yet. But for example, we look at metals. I don't have steel in here because that's not something the World Bank tracks, but aluminum's down 27%, nickel's down 24%. We all remember the March meltdown on the London Metal Exchange, where nickel at one point went over $100,000 a ton. So fortunately, it's actually down from the $48,000 per ton high it was at earlier. On the edible oil side, which has definitely contributed to food inflation, we see decreases across the board. The big one to watch for right now is palm oil, because that's actually the largest edible oil. The harvest is going better. We're not seeing the export restrictions that we thought coming out of South Asia. So this is looking a little bit better. Fertilizers have received a lot of attention. Well, they're finally starting to move into a little bit of a deflationary situation. They're still very elevated from 2021, but they're not quite as high as they were. And so overall, things are getting a little bit better, but it is going to take months and months and months for these, commodity deflationary forces to get to consumers. And here's the caveat. We're not considering energy prices here. And right now, we know energy prices are very elevated. That is going to counteract some of this. And right now, sorry, go ahead, Bob.
No. So we all know that the Fed is really under a lot of pressure to make some dramatic changes. So if they raise interest rates by another 100 basis points, how quickly is that a club that will hammer down some of the inflationary pressures, or are these things coming from different reasons? And so what would the effect of the interest rate hike be?
I think in our instance right now, we're actually looking at where, really the Fed only has that, blunt force trauma of trying to cull demand, for lack of a better term, by raising interest rates. Unfortunately, I don't see that being that deflationary right at the moment, because one, we've had commodity price boom for various reasons. I mean, one, commodities have basically been in a hole since about 2014 in general. Two, we have so many supply issues and supply shortages that we're still dealing with. Three, we have the tightest labor market right now we've seen since the late 1990s, which is why when people say to me we're in a recession, I scoff at that, because you don't have quit rates 20% higher than in 2018 and 2019 and tell me we're in a recession, because quits are the most pro-cyclical economic indicator you can look at. So we're not in a recession. That's one thing everybody has to understand. Forget GDP. GDP is really a useless measure for business planning purposes because of how it's calculated. And so what I would tell folks is, we're not hiking interest rates isn't going to fix labor markets quickly. And so I just think that really the Fed has sort of that one blunt force tool. That's what they're using. They're trying to signal to the markets they're serious about things. But I think overall, it's going to take a while. Again, I think we're in another, at minimum 6 months, but probably closer to a year cycle to start getting consumer prices back to the Fed's target. And honestly, I think 2% is unreasonable now. I think the Fed will probably readjust like the PCE year over year gains to 3%. I think that'll be a more reasonable inflation target.
Okay. And it's going to take a while to get there, so plan accordingly.
Yep. Unfortunately, that just seems to be where we're at right now. As we know, I think we've almost had for a lot of things a deflationary period. When you look especially at a lot of goods from about 2015 through 2020, because we had low commodity prices, energy was very cheap. And we're essentially putting ourselves back towards the previous trend line that really would have existed from about 04 through 14. The problem is we move back to that trend line in about 18 months rather than doing it over the course of years.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will keep watching, and we will keep bringing you back to update us as we go along. So thank you very much, Jason Miller.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. This is Global Sourcing Insights from CIPS. I'm Bob Rossbeck. Have a great day.